So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first Webinar Wednesday from the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR. My name is Amy Miller, and I'm the Federal Grants Administrator at OPR. First, a few housekeeping items. All materials from today's webinar will be shared on the OPR website. You'll receive a follow-up email tomorrow with that link, as well as a survey we hope you'll fill out. There are handouts available to download now under the Handouts tab on your window. You can write any questions that you have throughout the presentation in the Questions tab, and we'll be able to answer them at the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Karen Norris, but first I'd like to say a few words about OPR. We are the state's comprehensive planning agency, and one of our responsibilities is being the state's single point of contact for federal grants. I'd like to briefly share some resources on our website, which you can access by hovering on the Clearinghouses heading on the OPR homepage and selecting Federal Assistance. As the single point of contact, the State Clearinghouse at OPR receives notices of all federal grant applications that are subject to intergovernmental review. Applicants will select the Applying for Federal Grants link to enter their information and the grant application cover sheet, and then the notice of their application will be automatically sent to all registered state, county, and local elected officials in their area for their review. We also have tons of helpful information on the Federal Grant Resources page to help you learn about grants, how to apply for them, how to manage them, as well as direct links to the grants pages of each federal agency. The last thing I'd like to share is our federal grants e-list, which hopefully most of you receive, but if not, you can sign up for it here. This is a weekly email with updates on new federal grant opportunities, workshops, and other information and events. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Karen Norris. Karen is a nationally recognized expert in the federal grants community based in the Washington, D.C. area. She is a consultant with Kanoko Consulting and regularly presents at state and national conferences. As a subject matter expert, Karen has provided testimony to the Maryland General Assembly and the United States Senate Subcommittee on Federal Financial Management about federal grants. And we're very happy to have her share her insights on the changes that we're seeing in federal grants this year. So thank you, Karen.
Well, thanks, Amy. That was a great introduction, and I'm just delighted to be here with you today to present this webinar. I tell you what, the state of California is very lucky to have such a well-organized clearinghouse and under the governor's office. Not every state's offer things, training like this. So it's really a pleasure to be part of it. We're going to start off with two polls. And the first poll, thanks, Amy. Amy and I are going to be tag teaming it with the technology today. So first of all, to go ahead and fill in what type of organization are you representing so we can get a feel of who is listening in today in the webinar, and it will also help guide me with my comments, my commentary. So go ahead and select one of the following. So state, great, thanks, Amy. And look what we have, about half of us, almost half of us, 46% are state, county, local governments, no one from a tribal government or organization, higher ed, 27%, nonprofit, 22%, great, and other. And the other could be, all right, very good, combination of for-profit or maybe consultants. So that's great. Now, the second poll is, how long have you been working with grants? So 1 year or less, 2 to 5 years, 6 to 9 years, 10 years or more. And we'll give you a couple moments. Okay, Amy. So, all right, we have about a third of us are a year or less, so that's significant. And 2 to 5 years, 6 to 9 years, and look at that, 38, almost 40%, 10 years or more. And I've been in the grants business for long time. So this is really a nice diverse class, and it's important to know the uniform guidance was first made effective for all federal agencies and all non-federal entities for everybody on December 26, 2014. And before that date, we were all using the OMB circulars. There were 8 circulars that provided guidance how to administer grants. And for those of us who've been in the business for 6 years or longer, we used the old circulars, and when the guidance was first released, we had to adjust to it. And that's harder. That was harder. At least it was harder for me than you would have imagined, because the word sounded the same, but it was written really differently. And for those of us who are new, you only know the uniform guidance. So you only have to cope with the current changes of the uniform guidance rather than this big transference of skill sets and habits that we used to have under the old circulars that no longer apply. So let's go ahead and start the webinar. And Amy's going to move her cursor, and I'm going to try to forward. There we go. So for the learning objectives, we're going to talk about 4 things, basically. And first, we're going to look at past federal regulations and legislation and other federal actions that have impacted excuse me, the uniform guidance, because past is prologue. How did we get to where we are today, and what happened in the past to get us here? And then number 2, we're going to look at some past funding issues that have placed grants at risk. What's all the fuss about these new regulations, and why are there so many regulations? Well, the funding, it's all about the money, and we'll talk about that in learning objective 2. 3 is the main part of the webinar is, well, just what are these proposed 2020 updates, and we'll go over them one by one. And then technology has become such a focal point with the management and administration of grants that I've added a little on the last learning objective that just has to do with technology. And there's a lot of talk about data analytics and standard data elements for grants. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the changes that are going on with technology as well. So a few words. Excuse me. The uniform guidance is a living document. It's not going to stay the same. You know, the old circulars, they were the same for like 30 years. There were a few updates for the budget circular, the A133 circular, but they were pretty standard. And the uniform guidance has been changed. This is the 3rd big change that I know of since it was released in 2014. So it's not only updated, but it's updated pretty frequently. So these revisions occur over time as new legislation and other requirements are implemented. So OMB released a proposed update to the uniform guidance this past January, on January 22nd. And they went through a comment period which closed on March 23rd, and now OMB is in the process of reviewing the comments it received. There were a little over 200 comments, and once they go through it, and if they decide to make any revisions, further revisions, they will do so, and then they will submit a final rule later this year. We anticipate it sometime later this year. We don't have an estimated date yet. So all of the changes that we're going to talk about in today's webinar are still at the proposed stage. Now, when they did these updates last time, pretty much everything they proposed, they did. They tweaked it a little bit, but it was pretty much what they had put out as proposed turned out to be final. So we'll see what happens this time. So in addition to what OMB announced in January, there are other influences. The president's management agenda is one. And of course, with every White House administration, each president has his own management agenda. And then there's something called executive orders and presidential memos. And then lastly, we don't want to forget about all the developments that are happening in technology and how data is being used. You know, that also changes the way we manage federal grants. So let's look at some of these past regulations and legislations. And by the way, if you have a question about anything, don't hesitate to go ahead and submit it to, while the question is on your mind, in the question box or in chat, and we will go ahead and answer those after the slide presentation. So first of all, let's all get on the same page with vocabulary. There are three main federal regulations that govern grants. And of course, the first one is the program statute. Every grant is created out of some public law. The program statute is also called an authorization, and the public law is, or the program statute, is codified into law in this big compendium of laws called the United States Code, the U.S. Code. And that set of laws is considered constitutional law or congressional law. It's the process when the Senate might have propose a bill, and then they'll review it and approve it, and then the House will look at it and they'll review it and maybe offer some revisions, and it will go back and forth. And when the Senate and the House agree, they punt the bill to the White House, and if the White House agrees, the White House will sign the bill and it becomes enacted into law. So that's the U.S. Code. Then we also have the federal agency regulation, which is codified into law in another set of laws called the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR. And every federal agency will have its own regulation. And then we have, of course, the uniform guidance. And most classes, and this webinar certainly, is based on the uniform guidance. The uniform guidance is also codified into law in the CFR. But the uniform guidance is just a piece of the puzzle, because there's information that would be in the program statute that would not necessarily be in the uniform guidance. And the same thing with the federal agency reg. There's information in the federal agency reg that isn't always in the uniform guidance. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency will have a lot of rules and regulations about pollution in its federal agency reg, and you won't see one word about pollution in the uniform guidance, and most likely not in anybody else's federal agency reg. So the federal agency regulation will reflect what the uniform guidance says, but it will also have some additional requirements in it that are specific to that agency reg. So which one do you follow? Since we have three different regulations and they're all laws, they're all codified into law. So Karen, which one do we follow? Well, the U.S. Code, number one, takes precedence. Constitutional law takes precedence. The U.S. Code takes precedence over the Code of Federal Regulations, which is considered federal administrative law rather than congressional law. So whatever's in that program statute, that takes precedence. And now you look, well, what about the federal agency reg and the uniform guidance? They are both in the CFR. Wouldn't they be equal? Well, mostly yes. But again, the federal agency reg is going to have some more specific language in it, like the EPA example, than the uniform guidance. So if there is a difference between what the federal agency regulation says and the uniform guidance, you would follow the most restrictive regulation. That is the best practice. When there is a difference in regulations, the rule of thumb is that you follow the most restrictive regulation. And among these three, that would, between the uniform guidance and the federal agency reg, that would most likely be the federal agency reg that would take precedence because it would be more restrictive. And then we have other public laws or legislation. We have something called executive orders, and we have something called presidential memos. And before I even, let me go back a slide. In addition to the federal public laws and legislation, we have federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial laws that make a difference, and we would have the laws that would be highlighted in the award document that you receive. So we're talking to the state of California agencies, and you would receive your funding, federal connected funding would be awarded to a state agency who would then pass through the funds as subawards to nonprofits and institutions of higher ed and maybe county and city governments. So now we have this other extra layer of regulation. What happens if there's a difference between the state regulation and the federal regulations? Which one do you follow? And again, we take the same best practice. The rule of thumb is you would follow the most restrictive regulation. And sometimes that could be the state reg, and sometimes that could be the federal reg, whichever one is most restrictive. So let's look at some of these public laws that happened in the past. So going back to 1977, I like starting there because that's the act, the Federal Grant and Cooperative Agreement Act. That's the act that actually defined what a grant was, and that it was an assistance agreement. A grant and a cooperative agreement are given to non-federal entities to go out and perform a public good, as opposed to a federal contract. So this law makes a distinction between, it defines what a grant and a cooperative agreement is, and then it also makes a distinction that it's different. It's a different type of an award than a federal contract, which is considered like a procurement agreement. And then the next big one, about 20 years ago, is the Federal Financial Assistance Management Improvement Act, FAMIA. And that is a mouthful, but the significance with this act is that it created grants.gov. So it's hard to believe for those of us who have been in the grant business for a short amount of time. You can't imagine not submitting grant proposals other than through grants.gov. It's always been there for you. We used to do it all paper-wise, and the announcements were published in the Federal Register announcement, and everything would be a paper submission. And I tell you, you needed a wheelbarrow to wheel all the copies down. So that was a significant change. And by moving to a digital process, it helps standardize the pre-award process. So grants.gov was actually launched in 2002 under this act. And then 4 years later, we have down below the line, the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, FFATA, and that added two important words in the grant business, accountability and transparency, and it also created another digital asset. It created usaspending.gov. So now we have a digital format for submitting progress reports. It's a website for progress reporting. So now we have digitally pre-award and digitally post-award. In 2009, Congress and the White House became, painful aware that we're having a lot of improper payments, their audit findings and disallowances. And these improper payments could be anything from an unintentional error like Oh, I needed a receipt? I didn't know I needed to keep my receipt. You mean I can't get paid if I don't have my receipt? So the White House issued an executive order, and so that's what that EO is with the numbers behind it, saying, listen, Congress, federal agencies, we've got to do something about these improper payments. At the same time, in the federal contract community, not the grant community, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is an annual act that's an appropriations act for federal contracting, said, hey, we agree, and there are all these improper payments, and we're going to do something about it in the contract community. We're creating this new website called FAPIS, the Federal Awardee Performance Integrity Information System. And federal agencies, before you give out a federal contract award, you better check the risk rating. You better check how risky that contractor is, and if they are, don't give them the award and put them in this system. So that was a really big deal, and we ignored that in the grant community because it was only for federal contracts. That's not going to pay, that's not going to affect us, right? And then in the same year, we have the American Recovery Act, and which had a big stimulus, was a big stimulus bill, and a lot of funding to help the economy, and they had their own website, recovery.gov. In 2010, we have the passage of an Improper Payment Elimination and Recovery Act, IPERA, which took that executive order and it bumped it up. It raised the bar on that. It's now not only an executive order, it's a real public law that passed Congress and was approved by the White House. And they created another digital website called payment.accuracy.gov. And in a couple slides, don't worry about trying to write all this down. I have a list of all these links for you in a couple slides, so you'll have them available. And payment.accuracy.gov, if you've never heard of that site, or if you've never seen that site, it would be interesting to go visit it and see what it's all about. And that site keeps track of all the recovery audits that federal agencies do every year. How much money are they taking back from non-federal entities, and who are they taking the money away from? Moving on, in 2011, we have a presidential memo that created the Council of Financial Assistance Reform, and COFAR worked with OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, to create the uniform guidance. So they were thinking, you know what, with all this problem with improper payments, these circulars don't seem to be doing the job. We're going to have to beef up our guidance, our federal guidance. So COFAR and OMB were given the responsibility to come up with new federal regulations, and then which resulted in a couple years later with the uniform guidance. And in 2012, they improved the Improper Payment and Elimination Act. In 2013 and 14, we now have the uniform guidance that has been that was created and implemented for everybody to follow. Also in 2014, we have the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, the Data Act, and they were going to improve usaspending.gov, and they also created 57 standard data elements to use in grants, in grant reporting and grant submissions, just in the management of grants. In 2015, that National Defense Authorization Act, you know what, guys? We like the way this FAPIS is working out within the federal contract community. So now all you grant people, you've got to do FAPIS. Also, you have to do pre-award risk assessments. And if the applicant is too risky for an award, maybe you should think about not giving them an award at all and entering them into FAPIS. Now, at the state level, we have an awful lot of mandatory or formula grants. So that decision is a little harder to do, just deny the award, because there's a program statute that says, well, we're entitled to that award. But the federal agency can delay the funding until some issue of risk. Maybe there's a missing audit report, an audit finding that hasn't been corrected. Maybe there's a missing progress report. The federal agency can delay that award until the issue is corrected now. And for pass-through entities, for those of you who are pass-through entities, you can delay your subawards to your subrecipients if you have a subrecipient now that's high risk and needs to correct some issues. Moving on to 2016, we have the GONE Act, which is the Grant Oversized New Efficiency Act, which had to do with the closeout process for federal agencies. And we'll see when we get to the updates with the uniform guidance, they are strengthening the language in the uniform guidance about closeout, and they're applying the pressure to finish the closeout and what happens if a non-federal entity is lagging behind in closing out its awards. So we'll be sure to talk about that. Under the current presidential administration, under President Trump, he released his management agenda in March 2018, and there are about a dozen or so cross-agency priority goals. One of them, goal number 8, has to do specifically with grants. In 2019, below the line there, the purple, we have something that passed called the Evidence Act, which has to do with grant reporting and showing evidence and performance and showing results in the grant reporting. In 2019, passed at the very end of December, the Grant Reporting Efficiency and Agreements Transparency Act. That's the GREAT Act. And that is going to propose some standard data elements for grant reporting. So more technology, and we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. And then in 2019, they redesigned the compliance supplement, which is a set of instructions for auditors that have to do single audits. It's also good for non-federal entities and even federal agencies to get a copy of and look at the compliance supplement, because it gives you insight into how the single audit will be conducted for the year. Now here is the slide with all the websites of the different digital assets that we had talked about. And I had mentioned an executive order, so exactly what is that, and how is that different from a public law? Well, an executive order delivers a statement or a proclamation from the White House, and it can be on a wide variety of matters, from naming a statute to significant domestic actions. Now, every White House administration since George Washington has given out executive orders, and in years gone by, they were mostly proclamations. You know, let's name a statue, let's name a federal building. But recently, since the Democrats haven't been getting along so well with the Republicans and vice versa, and the House doesn't always get along with the Senate and vice versa, and the Congress doesn't always get along with the White House and vice versa, and it doesn't seem to matter whether we have a Republican administration or a Democratic administration in the White House. It is a fractious environment. A White House will turn to an executive order because it allows the White House to bypass Congress and make a proclamation. It is considered a law. So we're seeing more and more of these executive orders in modern times, and these executive orders have the force of law, but they bypass Congress. And because they bypass Congress, they create a lot of drama. They also create drama because there's no appropriation with an executive order. So if you have a real public law, that's passed through that legislative process with the House and the Senate, that public law is going to get an appropriation. So there's money behind the law. And so people are actually able to implement it. With an executive order, it bypasses Congress, so that creates a lot of dissension, and there's no money. So people have, what do we do with this law? How are we going to implement it? It's an unfunded mandate. So lots of drama with these executive orders lately. So here's some examples of executive orders from years gone by. And of course, Lincoln started off with the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order, and he knew that he was not going to be able to get it passed into law. He had to do it in incremental steps. But before the civil law was finished, his White House administration was able to transition that executive order into a public law. In fact, there were 3 Civil War public laws that were passed that had to do with emancipation and voting rights and equal rights. So that was really an interesting history lesson with that process. Truman integrated the armed services through an executive order, and during wartime, presidents tended to use these executive orders a little bit more frequently. Now, the first George Bush, for some reason during his presidency, he restricted public access to the White House papers, presidential papers. We don't know why, but that's what he did. And then another interesting aspect about these executive orders, another president that comes behind the president that issued the executive order can rescind it. So when President Obama became president, he goes, I think I'm going to just get that off the books. I'm rescinding that executive order, and it goes away. So executive orders can be quite contentious little things. It just depends. It's a sign of the times. So here are some executive orders that were passed in the past, and they start with an executive EO and a number, and you can see they started with suspension and debarment and improving program performance and reducing improper payments. And so these are some examples. There are many more of them. Not all executive orders affect grants, but a good many of them do. And now we have something called a presidential memorandum. And a presidential memo is not a law. It's administrative. It's a memo, just like any state or any institution of higher ed or nonprofit or for-profit. They'll issue business memos for staff to follow. So a presidential memo is a memo from the White House, and it's issued through OMB, and it's issued to federal agencies to take an action on a particular matter. And sometimes it's very helpful to get a copy of these presidential memos, because if the agencies have to take certain actions, the requirements generally flow down to the states and the locals. So like the executive orders, these memos can also be rescinded by a subsequent presidential administration. And they're not new. Every White House administration since George Washington has had presidential memos. There may be 24 to 36 a year. Not all of them deal with grants, but a good many of them do. So in the year 2000, under President Clinton, we were afraid, I don't know if any of you remember, we were all afraid that when the computers went from 1999 to January 1st, 2000, all the computer systems were going to crash. So there was all this flurry about Y2K readiness and what do we do if the computer system crashed, which never happened, but we were ready. And then George Bush reminded agencies in 2004, hey guys, we now have grants.gov and you guys are still posting your grant announcements in the Federal Register. We'll stop that. If you want to, go ahead, but as a supplementary announcement, you must post your your NOFOs, your Notice of Funding Opportunity, your solicitation packages must be posted on grants.gov. Do it. So that was in 2004. He gave, and grants.gov was launched in 2002, and it took people a long time to get used to it. And then President Obama said, hey, you know, the uniform guidance is new, and we created it because we have all these improper payments and we've got to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. So we need to report metrics on the uniform guidance to make sure that the uniform guidance is effective. And when President Trump became in office, nah, we don't need to do that. I'm going to rescind the metrics of the uniform guidance. And he did through a presidential memo. So here are some memos that impact financial assistance, and we see them, one on COFAR, and the way these memos go, the M number, they start with an M number. The first two numbers, the 11, the 12, the 14, the 19, that stands for the year that the memo was released, and the last two numbers is the number of the memo. So the M19-16, the last one on this line, that memo was released in the year 2019, and it was the 16th memo of the year. So the uniform guidance has been and will continue to be updated since its first release. So here is a big release that happened in July. OMB announced with GSA that they were going to replace the DUNS number. So this is a really big deal because everything is based on the DUNS number. Every non-federal entity has to have a DUNS number. You need it to register in SAM.gov, you need it to register in grants.gov, you need it to put it on your applications that you submit, your progress reports, your financial reports. That DUNS number is everywhere, and they're getting rid of it, and they're going to replace it with something called a unique entity identifier number, and I have a slide with more detail on that shortly. The uniform guidance was updated in 2015 when FAPIS was made applicable to the grant community, not just the contract community, and they revised the procurement. First, there was a 3-year grace period, and now there are new procurement thresholds, and there was a presidential memo instructing federal agencies what action to take about that. That was M1818, and now as part of the new proposed updates for the uniform guidance, they're going to update the procurement provisions in the uniform guidance. They're proposing that. So for those of you who have been trying to look things up in the uniform guidance, it's not easy to look things up because things are all over the place. There are basically 6 subparts of the uniform guidance: subpart A, B, C, D, E, F. And the uniform guidance is codified into law under Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR Part 200. So all of the numbers, all the provision numbers in the uniform guidance are going to start with a 200 because it's under Part 2. And that's just to raise your awareness. Hopefully that makes it a little easier to look things up. Now, under the current uniform guidance, subpart A, where all the definitions were, there were 99 definitions, and each definition had its own number: 200.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.69, up to 99, and it was difficult to remove a definition or change it or add a new definition. So one of the proposed revisions of this uniform guidance is that we're going to change all the definition numbers. Every definition is going to be 200.1. So in that way it gives us more flexibility to remove or add definitions as we need them. And then subpart B is general provisions. That's going to be 200.100. The pre-award provisions are going to be the 200 numbers. The post-award are going to be the 200.300 numbers. Cost principles, 200.400 numbers, and audit are the 500 numbers. So you can see a numeric pattern to the numbering, which hopefully will help you look things up a little more easier. And then in addition to these 6 subparts, there are 12 appendices. So I think I had skipped a poll. Amy. No, I think the poll is coming up. So that's great. And we're at funding levels and risk. Amy, is this a slide? Because I had slide 23 marked and we have slide 27 here. Should we go ahead and put up the poll and let people guess how much funding they think? Thanks, Amy. I just don't want to overshoot it. It's okay for a little easy. Now, we want you to take a guess. Oh, this is improper payment. This isn't, okay, I'm sorry, Amy, let's put that aside. Let's first guess how much money there is. And I don't think we had a poll on that. So my apologies, everyone. So in the chat box, thanks. Just go ahead and take a guess. There's no right or wrong answer. And even with our polls, when we eventually get to that poll, there's no right or wrong answer, but we do want you to click through so that, to show attendance in the for the webinar. There's no CEU credit for this webinar, but it just is good. So if anyone has a guess, how much money do you think is given out in federal awards each year? Anybody want to venture a guess in chat? I'll tell you the answer, but I was just wondering. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and advance the slide. Thanks, Amy, for all your help. So here we go. Look at that number. For federal contracts, $507 billion a year for federal contracts. And what a surprise, federal grants and cooperative agreements, financial assistance has now surpassed federal contracting. There are more grants than defense contracts, which is quite remarkable. $700 billion a year are given out in grants. And then you put the two of them together, and there's $1.2 trillion of federal money that's put in the hands of non-federal entities to administer grants. And there are issues, there are improper payments with that. The flip side of the coin is not only is $700 billion given out in grants every year, but there is a ton of money that is given out in grants that is improperly paid. And now we're going to get to that. Thanks, Amy, the next poll. So go ahead and we're going to put the poll up. And Amy's taking control back so she can put the control up, the poll up. Control the poll. So look what people did. You've already answered. You guys are fast. So it's pretty much split between 17.5 million, 175 million, and $175 billion of improper payments every year. So let's see how much money is given out. And we've lost our slides, poor Amy. Here we go, yay. Everybody give a round of applause to Amy, she's awesome. Oh my goodness, so now let me see if I can advance the slides. Look at that, last year, $175 billion were improperly paid. And going back a few years, in 2012, it was 108 billion, 106 billion. 2014 was the year the uniform guidance came out, $125 billion improper payments. And this is what we know about. And you can see the sorry story. It's just increasing year after year. And this is coming out of a Government Accountability Office report. And I've referenced the report for you with the report number in case you want to look it up. They're saying, well, this is terrible. I thought things were supposed to be getting better. So why are the improper payments getting worse? And this could be everything from, again, an unintentional error, like, oh, I didn't know I had to have a receipt. I didn't know I had to have prior written approval before I could make that change. And now I have a disallowance. You know, could be anything from an unintentional error to the full going through the other end of the spectrum to out and out waste, fraud, and abuse, which is intentional. And so why is it so bad? And one possible explanation is, well, there's more money that's given out in federal awards each year. We're constantly growing. And another possible explanation is that, well, we're keeping track of it better now than we used to. We now have the Improper Payment Elimination Act, and federal agencies have to report on the money that they're taking back. So we'll see, but it doesn't look good to have this figure constantly increasing. So here's just another pie chart. In 2001, look at the difference in 20 years. $3.7 billion was improperly paid. In 2014, they took back $32.7 billion, and in 2016, they took back about $20 billion, and it's been averaging about $20 billion a year since then. And this is coming from a report by the Council of Inspector Generals on Integrity and Efficiency. It's a SIGI report. Every federal agency has an Office of Inspector General, and each of these Inspector Generals are part of a council, the SIGI, and they put out reports. They have an interesting website called oversight.gov. If you've never seen that website, that would be an interesting website. It tells you all of the audit findings and all that non-federal entities disputed, and they tried to argue and beat it, and they had disputes. They went through appeals. In some cases, they went to court and they sued, and then SIGI keeps track of all those audit findings and whether the non-federal entity won or the federal agencies and the auditors won. So basically, there is a need to recover improper payments. There's a need for greater stewardship of federal funds, and a need to track the risk of non-federal entities to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. The philosophy is the higher the risk a non-federal entity poses, the more likely there'll be waste, fraud, and abuse. Okay, so here we go. Let's check on what these updates are for the uniform guidance. So first of all, here's the Federal Register notice and which volume it was, and here is the link to it. So Amy is making these slides available to everyone, and she'll post it on the website so you can get a copy of these slides, and then you will have this link available if you would like to go check out the original announcement in the Federal Register. In addition to the Federal Register notice, under the President's Management Agenda, President Trump has created a website called www.performance.gov. And on this website, all the progress that's being made toward his goals and his performance agenda, his president's management agenda, are being tracked on this website. So goal 8 is about grants. And here's the link that takes you to the performance.gov website with the goal 8. And under Cap Goal 8, you have these innovation sessions where they have the proposed revisions to the uniform guidance. And what's nice is that this is a track changes version of the uniform guidance. So it's the current guidance as we now see it. And then they've actually put track changes on, and you can see the red line where OMB has actually made all the changes. And then they had public comments were requested at regulations.gov. They were due through March 23rd, and now the final rule will subsequently be published in the Federal Register after OMB has a chance to go through all those comments. So the updates are focusing on 4 strategies. They want to standardize grants management business processes and data, and there's the key word data. That means data analytics, it means standardized data elements. They want to build a shared IT infrastructure. They want to make it easier for federal agencies and non-federal entities to share data through reporting, financial reporting, progress reporting, and if the data elements are standardized, then it's easier to compare. It's easier to monitor and detect and prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. It's easier to manage risk. And then it's easier to see if non-federal entities are actually achieving the program goals and objectives that they promised in their proposals. So there are 4 sections of Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations that have been updated. So the Code of Federal Regulations is this big old document of laws, and there are 50-some titles. So the title is like a chapter of a book. So if you can picture a great big book with 51 chapters, that's the Code of Federal Regulations. And under Chapter 2 or Title 2 of the Code of Federal Regulations, you have further parts, it's like sub-chapters. So the uniform guidance, your last bullet, is part 200, which means that there are 199 other parts in Title II before you catch up with the uniform guidance. And then after the uniform guidance, there are a ton of other parts. So these 4 parts have to do with changes. So the 4th one is the uniform guidance. The other 3, 2 CFR Part 25, Part 170, and Part 183 have updates also that affect grants. And we're going to go over each one. So 2 CFR Part 25 existed before, but now it has been updated, and this is where it's codified into law that the unique entity identifier is going to be the new identifier. We're transitioning away from the DUNS number. Non-federal entities have to register or renew annually in SAM, and this transformation is supposed to take place this year when non-federal entities renew their registrations in SAM.gov. They're supposed to receive their new UEI number. Now, with the COVID-19 and one of the presidential memos that we're going to talk about in a little bit, they are relaxing some of these deadlines. But if you haven't heard about this big DUNS number transition, please make a note of it, and I have a link for you on the following slides. So registrants also have to provide information on their owners, their predecessors, parent and subsidiary companies, and in addition to the organizational information. So that's a big change too. Before that, you only needed to register the name of your company. Now they want to know who the president is and who the parent and subsidiary companies are for better tracking. So here's some verbiage. You, as the recipient, must contain current information in the system for award management. This includes information on your immediate and highest level owner and subsidiaries, as well as on all of your predecessors that have been awarded a federal contract or grant within the last 3 years. So that might be, make a little note of that. So this goes through, because it's still proposed, that might be some housekeeping that has to be done with SAM.gov registrations. And then there's going to be more housekeeping. There was a Federal Register announcement this past July about this big news, the DUNS numbers being phased out. And please understand that the DUNS number was 9 digits and the new number is going to be 12 digits. So right away, everybody's going to have to do some programming in their technology systems in order to accommodate the new number. And I wouldn't replace the DUNS number field. Not that I should be giving you advice, but I would think you would want to keep that field the way it is in case you need it for archive purposes, because that DUNS number goes back years and years and years and years, and you may need to look up something from an old DUNS number for an audit finding or something. You never know, you might need it. And then there should be a new field with this 12-digit number for the UEI. So make a little note, pass along to your technology departments. Hey, if you guys didn't know, the DUNS number is going to be phased out sometime this year, and we're supposed to be getting this new UEI number, and it's going to be 12 digits, and we've got to be able to enter it into all the reports. It's supposed to be assigned at SAM.gov Renewal, and non-federal entities will also receive new login credentials at a federal website called login.gov. So you should, you should make a note, when is your anniversary date for your renewal in SAM.gov, because you would want to pay attention to what's happening with your renewal this year. So here are 3 important links. Here's the link to login.gov, where you can check if you've gotten new authentication credentials assigned to you. Here is a link from the Government General Services Administration, GSA, /entity ID, which has some further detail about the reasons why they're getting rid of the DUNS number and how that change is going to take place. And then on my website, which is free, I've written an article about it that you're welcome to look at. In addition to 2 CFR Part 25 and the UEI number, there is some change to SubAward Reporting, which could affect you if you're a pass-through entities in the state and any subrecipients. They're going to require award and subaward reporting on the OMB designated government-wide website, which is usaspending.gov. That's not new, but now agencies must report awards over the micro purchase threshold, which used to be, currently it's $3,500. And now it's $10,000. The proposed change is $10,000, but it used to be a $25,000. So now more awards have to be reported, and award terms and conditions must also be included for awards over $30,000. So some changes there. You would think that would have been in the uniform guidance because it has to do with grant awards, but it's not, because they're contract awards and they're loan agreements and they're federal subsidies. There are all kinds of federal awards that are given out other than federal grants and cooperative agreements. So this award reporting is outside of the uniform guidance. It's under Part 170. And the reporting includes awards to federal agencies, foreign organizations, foreign public entities, and for-profits. There are some for-profits now that get grants. Usually for-profits get contracts, but a for-profit can receive a grant as well. And again, sub-award reporting over $30,000. This is a new section of the Code of Federal Regulation, Part 183, and apparently there were some issues in the federal contract community where the issues originated, where they were actually giving out awards in war-torn areas of the world like Afghanistan and Iraq, and they were actually making federal funding available to combatants, to hostiles, to the Taliban. Why would they do that? And so the National Defense Authorization Act of 2015 said, Hey, contract community, do not award federal contracts to hostiles or combatants. What are you thinking? Don't do it. And so it was apart from the grant community, again, for the federal contract community, but that National Defense Authorization Act sunset in December of 2019. So Congress said, this is important. We're making it a law. We're codifying it now into the Code of Federal Regulations, new Part 183. And this continues the requirement not only for the contract community, but hey, all you grant people, if you have any foreign grants, and there are a lot of grants through the Department of State, and Department of Education has teacher exchange programs, and Department of Agriculture has international grants. There are a lot of Health and Human Services. There are a lot of international grants. So do not give grant awards to hostiles. And this relates, excuse me, applies to grants over $50,000 performed outside the United States. So maybe not too likely for state of California, but you never know. So those were the other three updates to the other parts of Title II. Now let's get to the updates specific to the uniform guidance. There we go. Let me make sure I didn't jump ahead too much. Yeah. I was hitting it a couple times. Sorry for the whiplash, guys. So the first thing, we're going to start with Subpart A, and as I mentioned, all the definition numbers are changing. They're not going to be numbered 1 through 99 anymore. They're all going to be with the number 1. They'll all be there. They'll be organized alphabetically, but that's for the ease of addition or removal. The definition for non-federal entity was not revised, and that definition is currently under 200.69. And it has the usual suspects, state and local governments in that definition, institutions of higher ed, nonprofits, but it's missing 3 types of non-federal entities. It's missing foreign public entities, foreign organizations, and for-profit. So if you are involved in grants with any of these 3 different kinds of non-federal entities, you would need to make sure in the award agreement or your sub-award agreement that they must follow the uniform guidance, or they don't have to because they're excluded from the definition. I had hoped that they would have caught that what I feel is an error, and other folks do too. So I had actually submitted a public comment in March to ask that they include those in the uniform guidance. It's also missing federal agency as a recipient, and there are a few federal awards that go from federal agency to federal agency, like this PEPFAR, which is the President's emergency program for AIDS, relief of AIDS. And Burke, who was involved in that program, has now been in the news quite a bit with COVID-19. So that is one of these grant programs that goes from one agency to another before it goes to the recipients. There are new and definitions for what's called standard and common forms. Standard forms are used by all federal agencies government-wide, and common forms are used by 2 or more federal agencies or government-wide. And I feel like it's like COVID-19 instructions. Well, it could be this, but it could be that. But they're fooling with the definitions of standard and common forms, and OMB prefers the use of common form to encourage federal agencies to work toward common data solutions, increased efficiency, and better accountability. So it tells me that they're updating the forms, and they're maybe using the term common form rather than standard form. We're used to standard form. All the forms like SF-424 would be the common, the standard forms that are used in grant applications, and the standard form 425 is the federal financial report. So we have to keep our eye out on any any changes with that. One of the changes that we know that's being made is that the 424B is being phased out. There was a presidential memo on it, and the phase out was supposed to happen in last year. So this year, all federal agencies should not have that form in the application packets. If it's there, just go ahead and fill it out. Don't skip it and then run the risk of having a non responsive application. If it's still there and your agency hasn't gotten rid of the form, just fill it out. This federal form is the form, it's the assurance form that, like drug-free workplace, Civil Rights Act, those kinds of things, that these broad national policy requirements. Now that is still going to be required, but non-federal entities are supposed to sign these representations and assurances at the time that they renew in SAM.gov. So once a year for registration renewal, as opposed to signing it every single time you submit a grant. I think that's a good change. But in any way, there are updates to other forms too. And it's important just to be mindful that you're using the latest version of a federal form, just as a matter of routine, and now specifically because we anticipate there are going to be some additional changes, upcoming changes to federal forms. So we know that the standard form 425 has been updated, and its new expiration date is February 28th, 2022. All the property forms that are used for closeout in grants have been updated, and you can get in the habit of looking for expiration dates that are printed either in the footer, sometimes they're in the header, but I guarantee you they're going to be in teeny weeny little print, little font. You're going to need a magnifying glass in order to read it, but pay attention now to the expiration dates on these forms to make sure you've got the most recent form. And you can get the latest copy of forms on the grants.gov website under the Forms tab. So on the grants.gov homepage, there's a menu bar across the top of the page, and right of center, it's not all the way over to the right, but it's right of center on that top menu bar, you'll see a tab marked Forms. And if you click on it, you'll get a repository of all the forms that are used in federal grants, and they will have the latest copy there. You can download it and get a copy of your updated forms there. In 200-101, federal agencies, this is the applicability provision. Federal agencies may apply subparts A through E of the uniform guidance to those three missing entities, the for-profits, the foreign public entities, or foreign organizations, because there have been many complaints to OMB over the years, like, why did you leave these people out of the definition? But notice that it's a may, it's not a must. So again, you must make sure that if you are working with any of these agencies, that you specifically say they must follow the uniform guidance. Otherwise, they won't. And then there's still questions, well, what about Subpart F, which is the audit? Do these non-federal entities have to get a single audit if they have, if they match that $750,000 threshold? So again, you cover yourselves by making sure you specifically state that in your award or your subaward agreement that you give out. And the other 2 CFR Part 25 and 170 have been updated to include them. But for some reason, the uniform guidance was not updated, not this go around. So metrics and reporting have changes again. It used to be metrics every 5 years, and we had that presidential memo under the Obama White House that reaffirmed, yes, you have to do metrics, and the President Trump said, no, you don't have to do metrics. And by the way, I'm also rescinding COFAR. I'm disbanding it. No more COFAR. So that was in that same memo. And I think there's a typo there. Let me make a note, Amy. It's M17-26, slide 50. M17-26. We'll make a PDF of these slides and put them on the website, and I'll go ahead and correct that slide before Amy posts it to the website. And so she'll have that correction up there. So now President Trump says, look, we're not going to do these special metrics anymore. If you want to see progress on about grants, go to performance.gov and look at the President's management agenda under Cap Goal 8, and that's where you will see progress. Under 200-110, all negotiated indirect cost rates will remain in place until they're renegotiated, which is the way it's written now. But there is a change to indirect costs that are becoming effective at the non-federal entities fiscal year, and that has to do with the de minimis rate. So if you are using, oh, I didn't have it there. We'll have it. That's because this is 110 that says, just be aware of dates. If you're changing the indirect cost rate and you're changing the de minimis rate, the change will become effective at the non-federal entity's next fiscal year. And then when we get to the 400s, right now we're doing these changes in numerical sequence. We're on the 100 numbers. We'll get to what those changes are. And now we're starting the 200 numbers. There's a new 200.202, and it says, hey, grants and cooperative agreements, you must achieve your goals. You must support the President's management agenda. Right now, if you are submitting your reimbursements and have your receipts, whether you're performing well or not, you're going to be reimbursed. But we're going to start paying more attention to whether or not you're performing. So we're looking to see if there are going to be further changes in that regard. So granting agencies are to hold recipients accountable for performance, the federal agencies to their recipients, and the state pass-through entities to their subrecipients must be focused more on performance. And this reflects the Evidence Act, which we'll talk about, which is an act that was passed at the end of last year to advance data and evidence building functions. They did mention that logic models may be used, and if you like using logic models in your grants, that would be a good evaluation strategy. If you have not used logic models before, you can Google logic models. There's a ton of information. Kellogg Foundation uses the logic model. Several federal agencies use the logic model. It's basically a chart. There are different iterations of what a logic model looks like, but it's a handy tool. And, you know, we have 3 additional presentations for you in addition to this one. And if you'd like one on the logic model, just on a logic model, you can let Amy know and she can consider using that topic for a future webinar. We have some other ideas set up for you, but we'd like to hear from you too. What type of training would you like? So just let Amy know if you have special topics you're interested in. So there is the public notice of funding opportunities. The catalog of federal domestic assistance has changed its name. The old CFDA is now called Assistance Listings. The old website used to be www.cfda.gov, and it's now merged with sam.gov. And so it just basically says that the listing must align with federal agencies' strategic plan. So federal agencies have to follow this other circular called A111 where their strategic plans are. And now whatever priorities are in the grant has to match the strategic plan of the federal agencies. So 200-215 is a revised provision. It's new, and there's the provision to never contract with the enemy that we've talked about. And in 216, there is some prohibition now on certain video Surveillance equipment, I don't know what happened there, but it came out of this never contract with the enemy thing and was related to contract community, which is now affecting the grant community. And there's a list of companies to avoid. So if you are purchasing for any of your Homeland Security grants and you're purchasing communications equipment and video surveillance equipment, right now it's proposed, still in the proposed stage, but you would want to get a list of what those companies are that you need to avoid. Excuse me. In the 300 numbers under performance measurement, there's performance and measurement again. Federal awarding agencies and non-federal entities must measure performance. A lot of language throughout the update is focused on performance, results, goals, indicators, milestones now must be included in the award agreement. Under the current uniform guidance, that award agreement provision is 200-210. But they added that new 202 number, so it moved everything up a provision number. So if you are looking up that award agreement provision now under the current version of the uniform guidance, it is under 200-210. Under the new uniform guidance, once the revisions go through, it will be up a provision. It will be under 200-211. And it again mention of the Evidence Act. The procurement provisions have been updated. They're the new provision numbers. The current provision numbers are 200-317 to 326, and the new ones again have shifted a provision. And so the 3 fiscal year grace period ended in 2018, which means 2019, last year was the first year all non-federal entities had to follow the uniform guidance procurement provisions. Now there are issues because procurement is one of these things that is heavily governed by state regulation. So there may be a state procurement policy that agrees with the federal or flies in the face. So you would again follow the one that's most restrictive. And there I have the old citation numbers handy there for you under the third bullet in addition to the new numbers. And some of the things that were changed is they changed the micro purchase threshold from, it used to be $3,500, it's now $10,000. And the simplified acquisition threshold is being raised from $150,000 to $250,000. So the uniform guidance will now be updated with this change. You know, look at those dates. The National Defense Authorization Act made these changes in 2017 and 2018, and neither the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is the federal contract guidance, or the uniform guidance, which is for the federal grants, neither of them were updated. So now this is putting those updates through. And in the meantime, Presidential Memo 1818 allows everyone to use the new thresholds in advance of the updates. If you like those thresholds, get a copy of them 1818. So I like the change a lot, and they're very well received in both the grant and the contract community. So any purchase below the simplified acquisition threshold is considered a small purchase. That's the new citation number. The current citation number is 320B. 320B. So a small purchase is wonderful, and you can buy an awful lot of things that are $250,000 or less. And the attraction is that there's no need to follow this big complicated bid process that everyone doesn't like, that in the uniform guidance. You only need an adequate number, 2 or 3 price quotes. So how hard can it be to get price quotes for something, you know? So that is a streamlined, very much better procurement process. It's much simpler. You'll have to check it against the California state procurement process. to see which one would apply. 200-321 is new, and again, non-federal entities are encouraged to use goods and products and materials that are produced in the United States, and that sounds like it's pretty simple because it would say made in the USA, but a lot of the technology, like even the HP and the Dell and computers, American-made computers have Chinese parts inside and chips. So, how far does that definition go? We'll have to see. Well, it's an encouragement, it's not a must, so that won't be too much of a change. And here is the GREAT Act, the Grant Reporting Efficiency and Agreements Transparency Act. And I believe we have a poll here, Amy. And let me go ahead. Great. What does the GREAT Act mean? And again, if you can't remember it, it's okay. Just click on something. They were really fast, Amy. I think you could probably change it pretty quick. They got the other one when I said, "Oh, we're not ready for that yet." And look at that, you guys got it, 88% of you. That was hard for me to try to think of all those acronyms. So very good. Okay, let me try. Amy, if you can move, your cursor over. Okay, I'm going to try again. We have dueling cursors. Yay! Now I'm pressing it too much. So the GREAT Act is government-wide data standards for grant reporting. The GR, the important thing to remember about the GREAT Act that it has to do with GR, grant reporting. So they're going to have government-wide standard data elements in 1 year and new standards in 2 years, and everyone still needs to publish the grant reports on the government-wide website, usaspending.gov, but now we're going to have standard elements. So that's going to create, everyone's going to have to update their IT systems when that's finally out. And 200-335 says, listen, all your data collections have to be in these open machine readable formats. So that doesn't mean just put a report in PDF. It's a machine language. So, all the state agencies I worked with when I was in the field, we had old clunky servers that were as old as the hills. I guarantee you it was in some old machine language. So this would be something to check on. Your machine language, is it considered to be open machine readable? Here's the change with the de minimis rate. They are going to expand the definition to make it used to any non-federal entity may elect to use it. It used to be only if you never, ever, ever had a de minimis before. And now, let's say you're a non-federal entity and you've been struggling with a negotiated rate and you can't keep up with it. And if you only knew that you could have, the de minimis wasn't available at the time you got your negotiated. So now if you had a negotiated rate and you'd rather go back to a de minimis, you can. Not finalized yet, proposed, but this would probably be a very popular change in the uniform guidance. And then your negotiated rate, here's something that may trouble some people. They're going to create, or they're proposing to create, a website, like the Federal Audit Clearinghouse has everybody's audit reports are posted online. They want to post everybody's indirect rate agreements online. And that has very, very personal financial information for each non-federal entity in that. So that may or may not, we'll see what happens, what the public response will be to that. 343 has to do with closeout, and this is where I think the harshest change is. The subrecipients must submit final reports to pass-through entities within 90 days of the end of the period of performance. Now, it used to be, the end of the period of performance, and then closeout would start at the time that the non-federal entity submitted the report. But what happens is that subrecipients and recipients are tend to be late on these reports, and they're going to start monitoring these deadline dates a little more carefully. So subrecipients must do it within 90 days. The pass-through entities have 120 days. They give you another 30 days because you can't do your final report until you have the final report from your subrecipients. Federal agencies must complete closeout by 1 year after the end of the period of performance. This is a change. It currently says by 1 year after receipt of that final report. But if the final report is late or missing, you've got a problem for federal agencies. So now they're changing it 1 year after the end of period of performance, and there's some punitive language. If there's a new, the current 200-343 ended with G. Now they've added an H. If the non-federal entity does not submit the final report on time, the federal agency must, this is not a may, this is a must, close the project using the available information and must report the non-federal entity in FAPIS as a material failure to comply with the award terms. So that is very aggressive language. And there is the quoted language from the uniform guidance right there on your slide for you. That is very aggressive language. So if and there are reasons why these reports are late. What if you're still negotiating your indirect costs? What if you have a provisional rate and you don't have your final rate yet? What if there's an audit finding and it hasn't been corrected yet? What if you're a pass-through and you don't have all the information from your subrecipients yet? I mean, this is very harsh language. You must close out in 1 year whether you have the information or not. Use the information that you have available, and if the non-federal entity doesn't complete its process, then you enter them into FAPIS as a material failure to comply. So that's a big change. The compliance supplement, as we mentioned, has been updated, and a lot of people have not heard of that. If you've not used audit, you wouldn't necessarily be involved, aware of it, but it is a big document that's posted on the OMB website. One comes out every year around June. And they used to have 12 compliance tests, and each program had to be tested with these 12 tests. Now they're saying, well, there's still 12 tests, but only 6 programs are going to be tested. And the 2020 compliance supplement isn't out yet. So here are the timeline for these changes. The federal agency, the Federal Register notice was released on January 22nd. The public comments were due on March 23rd, and OMB is currently reviewing the public comments, deciding whether to incorporate any of those or not into the final rule, and we're waiting for the final rule. So everything that I've presented to you as changed in this presentation is hot off the press. It's still proposed. It's not final, but this gives you a tremendous insight into a forecast into what's coming down the pike. I'd like to mention some key presidential memos, and I have included them for you as your handouts. So and Amy will also include them on the website. There are 4 presidential memos that this is not part of the uniform guidance update, but they affect grants. And because of this current circumstance with COVID-19. And so the first one, number 11, had to do with recipients of COVID-19 grants. And then number 17 is the big one that came out and says, hey, yeah, we're going to make this available to everybody, all grants. And there were several flexibilities that federal agencies can apply. SAM.gov registration renewals can be expanded. federal agencies can waive application deadlines. So if you have reduced operational capacity and you are struggling getting a grant deadline done, it would be worth it to contact the federal agency to see if they are waiving that deadline because of COVID-19. So same thing, they're more flexible with no cost extensions. They can have abbreviated continuation requests. So this page and the next slide, these are important. Get a copy of that memo and read it. And then if you have any questions, you have the right to ask your federal agency. The subrecipients can ask the pass-throughs. The pass-throughs have the right to ask federal agencies what kind of flexibilities apply now under COVID-19. 2020 is an interesting memo. It says they can repurpose existing grants to COVID-19. So if you have some existing grant funds and you want to do some public service outreach or some announcements with your agency and you'd like to repurpose your funds, you can ask to do so. Likewise, federal agencies can repurpose existing grants and move the funding allocation to a COVID-19 purpose. So we'll see that memo is very short. As they said, they can do it under a class exception under 200-102 in the uniform guidance. And that is, again, something to communicate with the federal agency about. M2021 is all about expediency. If it's an emergency and you have to get things out for COVID-19, you can buy, there's flexibility with procurements. You can have emergency procurements. You have to take care of your data. And then your federal agencies have to report COVID-19 funding as disaster emergency funding, and they're being given a special reporting code to do that. And because they're treating COVID-19 funding as disaster funding, that could possibly flow down to the non-federal entities, so you would want to check. And those are up there on the website. And Amy, do we have a few more minutes? We are at 2:30 and I have a few slides to talk about with technology.
Yeah, we are at our time, but this does allow us to go a little over the time. So I think if people want to hang out and yeah, we'll just finish up the last section.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions at the end. So for technology, what do you need to be aware of? And I have to take control again. Please advance. Yay! Technology. So just what we talked about before, there's a growing importance of IT modernization. Everyone has to have these open machine readable formats. There's going to be importance of data and standard data elements and data analytics, and it's all to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse and to knock down that number of those improper payments. So the federal interest in data collections has been around for a long time, but now it's heightened. And we have all these federal websites. Under the Recovery Operations Center back in 2009, the Recovery Act created a data analytics center. They created a fraud risk scorecard, and they compared the progress reports that recipients of recovery funds posted on the website, and they went after them. They went after them, and they were looking for fraud, right? There you go, fraud. And they had unprecedented access to other databases. They had access to the Social Security Administration Death Master File, the HUD Credit Verification Bureau, FBI records, credit bureaus, and they compared the reports. They ran data analytics on the reports that were posted, and they went after people. People went to jail for misusing funding. So when the Recovery Act sunset, Congress morphed the Recovery Operations Center and they moved them over to the Hurricane Sandy Act, which was a big disaster relief act for the East Coast, northeastern East Coast, with a big hurricane. And they wanted to track the emergency funding with Hurricane Sandy. And so this, even though the Recovery Act went away, the Recovery Operations Center was kept alive to track Hurricane Sandy expenditures. And now it's still alive with the Data Act of 2014. The idea was to improve USAspending.gov. USAspending.gov is being transitioned from GSA to the Treasury so they could link it to the federal financial systems with the idea to improve data collections. It also created 57 standard data elements that federal agencies had to use. And here is the verbiage from the Data Act saying that we're going to create this data analysis center. So they took the old Recovery Operations Center. They are not calling it that anymore because the Recovery Act is long gone, but it's now alive and well in Treasury, and it is running data analytics on all the posted reports. There are several executive orders and federal agencies that have all echoed the same memo, the same mantra: must have accessible data, have to have open formats, machine readable, and standard data elements. And under the president's management agenda, he created this federal integrated business framework, and their job was to create standard data elements. Oh my goodness, they came up with 426 standard data elements, and that's where the link is. You can see them. Now, don't be like me. When I went up there and you get an Excel spreadsheet with the data elements, and it was blank, and so I wrote OMB, right? Silly me. I wrote OMB, and I said, but it's blank. I can't see it. Karen, it's an Excel sheet with a lot of pages. Look at the tabs at the bottom of the page and click on the tabs. So when you look at it, if you're curious, you're going to see it. Don't think it's blank. Click on the tabs. Oh my goodness. So again, excuse me, there is the link to the federal integrated business framework, and there's their focus on standard data elements, and they have 426 proposed elements for grants management. That's what the GM is for. Now, with the upcoming presidential election, if the same president is reelected, this is going to be continued. There'll be more of the same. If a different president is election, we will have to wait and see what happens with this these standard data elements under this FIBF group. So there is a website, strategy.data.gov, to keep track for federal agencies, to keep track of their federal use of data strategy. So there's the website for you. And they have 20 action steps. You can look at the reports or share that link with your IT department. Here are some more links for data: data.gov, excuse me, resources.data.gov, strategy.data.gov, Incubator. That's a site where they have case histories. Here's that Evidence Act. It has a big long name. And here's the public law. If you want to look it up, it has 3 titles. The middle title, Title 2, is called the Open Data Act, which is again focusing on this accessible data, open data, standard data elements. There is a presidential memo, M1923, that has anticipated outcomes. Open data is going to be default. There has to be a federal data catalog and a data inventory, and data assets need to be made available. Federal data assets need to be made available to non-federal entities. But in doing so, it has to be secure. So again, it's like, all right, it has to be accessible, but it has to be secure. It has to be shared unless it can't be shared because it's secure. So we'll wait and see. But the standardized data element is definitely a trend that's coming. So here are the timeline of changes again that we talked about. These changes are in proposed stage. The final rule will be published in the Federal Register to be determined. There is a growing interest in performance and results and a growing interest in data collections. So now, are there any questions?
Okay, so now going through questions about what's going to be made available. And we will share the link for the slides as well as the recording. So let's see here. It looks like we got a lot of questions. A lot of are mandatory audits required with federal grant awards, and are these published into the public recording?
Mandatory audits have a financial threshold, and the single audit is required if a non-federal entity receives and expends $750,000 or more of federal funds. Then an annual single audit is mandatory, it is required, and the audit report is published at the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. If a non-federal entity is below that single audit threshold, there is an abbreviated audit that a federal agency could do. It's called an agreed upon procedures engagement. And Amy, give me a list also of all these questions, and then I will write down the answers for everybody, because some of the answers are lengthy, and then that way they'll have the answers, and I can also provide links in the answers for you, and you can post that to your website. But the agreed upon procedures engagement is defined in the uniform guidance at 200.425. And that might be helpful for a pass-through entity. If you're a state pass-through and you have a subrecipient that you would really love to have audited because they need it, but they're below that $750,000 single audit and so they're not eligible, you can ask them to have this agreed upon procedures engagement. You can't have them pay for it, but you can charge the cost of it to your award. So a pass-through can charge it to their prime award from the federal agency, and they can require that a subrecipient have an audit.
Okay, we had another question about is there a website where all of the executive orders and memos are posted?
EOs, and I have the presidential memo link. Yes, the answer is yes, and I think there's probably a similar site for executive orders, but I will look for that. I will definitely send Amy to post on the website the link, and you can get access to every single presidential memo. They're organized by the year that they were issued. So it starts with 2020 at the top and then moves down to 2019 and so forth. That was a great question, and I think I'll, that would be a good link to have.
Yeah, there was another question about where people find information on the entities and individuals that were found guilty of fraud and abuse. Are they posted on our website?
Yeah, you can try oversight.gov. www.oversight.gov.
Okay.
Because the ones that were found guilty under the Recovery Act, that website is now gone. But go to oversight.gov.
Okay, thanks. And then just one last question, and again, we'll have all of these questions and answers provided on the OPR website as a follow-up as well. But question about the timeline for the transition from the DUNS to the unique identifier.
That's a great question. So the way the federal regulation notice reads is that starting in July of 2019, and they were slow to get started, non-federal entities were to start receiving two things at the time that they renewed their registration in SAM. Number one, they were to get new login credentials that were more secure. Number two, they were to receive their new unique entity identifier number at the time that they registered. So during 2020, during this year, when non-federal entities renew their registration in sam.gov, they are supposed to receive these two pieces of information. The unique entity ID is not scheduled to go live until January 1st, 2021, because they want to take the entire year, this year, to hand them out. They're going to be assigned incrementally. There are just too many non-federal entities to do it all in one fell swoop. So this year, watch for your sam.gov renewal and watch to see if you receive your new UEI number and login credential. I've done a little survey with some of the grant listservs, and so far people have, non-federal entities have received their login IDs, their new login IDs, but no one, last time I asked, has received their new UEI number yet. So I anticipate that that's going to be pushed back. That deadline is going to be pushed back. But make a note when your registration is due, and make a note to pay attention to it when you're renewing it to see if that number shows up.
Okay, well, I think with that, we will end our recording and end the webinar now. Thanks for everyone for staying a few minutes afterwards. We had a lot of content to go through. So just want to give a big thanks to Karen for sharing her information. Here's her contact information. And again, we'll be sending out an email tomorrow that has a link to the website where we will have all this information posted. So again, thanks everyone for your participation, and hope to see you at our next webinar. Bye.
Bye, everyone.